The Mitchells were the envy of their friends and family. Successful, loving, and seemingly perfect. But as Emily watched her husband, James, interact with their neighbor Rachel at their son's graduation party, a creeping suspicion began to cloud her thoughts. The tension between them was undeniable, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her instincts were right. What started as a simple unease soon turned into a shocking revelation. Her husband was having an affair. In a moment of intense emotion, Emily confronts James in front of everyone, ripping apart their carefully constructed facade. What was meant to be a proud moment for their family turns into a painful unraveling of everything they once held dear. How will Emily move forward after the truth is exposed? Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but for me, it's an extra motivation to keep creating videos. I'd also really appreciate a comment. Thank you for your support, and now let's continue with the story. The Mitchell house was alive with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, the culmination of years of hard work, the proud moment when their son, Ethan, would walk across the stage and receive his diploma. Family and friends had gathered in their sprawling suburban home, the backyard adorned with balloons and streamers, tables laden with food. Perfect scene. Yet, beneath the surface of this cheerful celebration, something gnawed at Emily. She stood in the kitchen, arranging a platter of hors d'oeuvres with trembling hands, the plates rattling slightly under her grip. The house was filled with guests, their voices rising and falling in a pleasant hum, but Emily felt isolated. She couldn't quite place the cause of her unease, but it lingered. She glanced out at the crowd, trying to ignore the rising tension in her chest, but the sight of James laughing, his shoulders relaxed, standing beside Rachel, only intensified it. Her pulse quickened, a slight unease twisting in her stomach. Rachel had been standing too close to him for too long, laughing a little too freely, touching his arm with an intimacy that felt too familiar. Emily watched as Rachel smiled at something James said, and then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers brushed against his sleeve. Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. It's just nerves, she thought. Just the stress of the day. But there was a pit in her stomach that told her otherwise. She should be feeling proud, happy for Ethan. But instead, she couldn't shake the sensation that her carefully constructed world was slowly slipping from her grasp. She tried to focus on the event around her, but her gaze kept drifting back to James and Rachel. Every time Rachel leaned in, or laughed a little too loudly, a ripple of discomfort washed over Emily. She had always trusted James. Always. Their marriage had been built on the kind of respect that, until recently, she believed was unshakable. They'd been through so much together. Raising Ethan, buying the house, and growing old together. It had always seemed like the perfect foundation. But this felt like something she couldn't ignore. The noise of the party faded into the background as Emily tried to process what was happening before her. Her eyes followed Rachel's movements with a steady, practiced detachment, but the clenching in her chest told her that something was wrong. She had seen the way James's eyes softened when Rachel spoke to him, the easy smile that played on his lips when he responded, the way his body angled just slightly in her direction, as though he was giving her attention that, by all rights, should have been hers. It wasn't an outright flirtation, not in the obvious sense, but it felt intimate in a way that unsettled Emily. She shook the thought away, forcing herself to turn her attention to the rest of the guests. Ethan was mingling with his friends, looking proud, his youthful exuberance lighting up his face. Emily forced a smile, her lips pressing into a thin line as she scanned the crowd. She had to let go of these thoughts, this dark inkling growing inside her. She wanted to focus on the celebration, on Ethan's achievement. But the knot in her stomach remained. It wasn't until the toast that Emily's discomfort reached its peak. The words were a blur, a mix of pride and admiration, but it was James's voice, raised with an exaggerated cheer, that caught her off guard. When he lifted his glass to toast Ethan's success, Emily felt the weight of the moment like a stone pressing against her chest. She turned her head, her eyes locking on Rachel, who stood just a few feet away, looking at James with something that Emily couldn't quite name. It was too much. It wasn't a fleeting glance. Rachel's gaze lingered a moment too long, her eyes following James's every move, and in that instant, something shifted in Emily. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the toast ended, guests began to mingle, talking in small clusters, their chatter blending into the hum of celebration. But for Emily, the world had narrowed. She felt the heat of her own breath as she tried to calm the rising tide of emotion within her. She had always trusted James implicitly, and yet, tonight, there was something between them, something she couldn't name but could no longer ignore. She sought refuge in the kitchen, a quiet place where she could gather her thoughts. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, the cool marble cold against her skin. She needed air, space, distance from the suffocating feeling that seemed to settle deeper into her chest. She turned toward the door, ready to step outside, but then she saw Rachel again, slipping into the kitchen behind her. "Oh, Emily," Rachel said brightly, her voice too high-pitched, almost as if trying to hide something. "I didn't see you there." Emily stiffened but forced a smile. "Just making sure everything's in order." Rachel leaned against the counter, her eyes flicking toward the crowd outside, where James stood, laughing with a few others. "He's really been great, hasn't he?" Rachel's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it that Emily caught, a certain warmth that bordered on something more. "Yes, he's always been a good friend," Emily replied, the words leaving her mouth almost mechanically. Her heart began to pound in her ears, the silence between them pressing in. Rachel didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care, her eyes still locked on James. "I love spending time with him. He's such a great listener." Emily's pulse skipped a beat. She couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A great listener. The phrase echoed in her head, cutting through the festive noise of the party. Was it her imagination? Or was there something too personal, too intimate in the way Rachel spoke? Her stomach churned. "Yeah, I'm sure it is," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, a forced smile tugging at her lips. Rachel flashed her a smile that was a little too knowing, a little too casual. Then, with a soft laugh, she turned and walked back into the crowd, leaving Emily standing alone in the kitchen. The air felt thick, as if the space had closed in around her. She exhaled, the breath shaky, trying to steady herself. It was becoming impossible to deny the truth. The pit in her stomach had deepened into something much darker. There was something going on between James and Rachel. Her hands gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She needed to know, needed answers before she fell apart entirely. But what could she do? Confront James now, in front of everyone? Or was there more to the story than she realized? She caught sight of James slipping out of the room, disappearing into the hall. The momentary absence of Rachel only deepened the weight in her chest. Emily's steps were automatic as she followed him, her heart beating faster with every step. Her mind raced. What am I doing? She found him standing alone in the backyard, near the edge of the yard where the trees began to form a shadowed boundary. He didn't hear her approach. Emily stopped a few feet away, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. "James?" she called, her voice soft but carrying the weight of her uncertainty. He turned quickly, a startled expression crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. His usual calm smile returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Emily? Everything okay?" She swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. Should I ask him now? But her body moved before her mind could settle the question. "Is there something going on between you and Rachel?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. For a long moment he didn't answer. He looked at her, his eyes darting away, and Emily's heart sank. The silence between them was thick with unspoken truths. "Why would you ask that?" he said at last, his tone defensive, almost too quick. "Because I see the way she looks at you," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "And the way you act around her. It's not just friendly." James's jaw tightened, and he glanced away, not meeting her eyes. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the truth settled over her like a cold fog. She had known, deep down she had always known. The guilt in his face was all the confirmation she needed. But even so, the words hung in the air, unspoken, between them. The night stretched out before Emily like a shadow, heavy and thick. The sounds of the party, a background hum of conversation, laughter, and clinking glasses, seemed to fade as she stood there, facing James in the dim light of the backyard. The warm summer air clung to her skin, thick with humidity, but it did nothing to ease the tension that wound tightly around her chest. It was like the world had shrunk to just the two of them, the faint flicker of the garden lights casting long shadows over the grass beneath their feet. Her throat felt tight, the heat of the evening stifling, but she didn't dare look away from James. He shifted on his feet, his fingers brushing the back of his neck in that old, familiar gesture that had once calmed her. Now it only made her stomach churn. His gaze darted from the ground to the party in the distance, then to the horizon, but never meeting her eyes. He couldn't look at her, not really, and the way he avoided her stare, turning his head almost imperceptibly, made the knot in her chest pull tighter. Emily. His voice was a low rasp, barely above the sound of the wind rustling the leaves above them. She said nothing, just stood there, her heart thudding against her ribcage. She didn't need him to speak. She didn't need explanations anymore. She needed answers, but the silence between them was thick, and each second felt like a weight that pressed deeper into her, threatening to crush her breath. "Are you?" James began again, but faltered. His words hung in the air, unfinished, like they didn't belong in the moment. He didn't know how to start, didn't know how to salvage whatever remained of the trust they had. The party continued in the distance, the clink of glasses and the light, breathless laughter of their guests drifting over to her like a distant memory. Emily could feel the vibrations of the music from the speakers, the dull thrum in the ground beneath her feet, but it all felt hollow now. Her pulse was louder in her ears than the party noise ever could be. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt dry, as if the air itself had hardened in her chest. "Is this what you wanted, James?" Her voice came out almost flat, but there was an edge to it that she couldn't suppress. Her hands, clenched at her sides, were trembling ever so slightly, the tension in her fingers radiating up her arms. James didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be fighting the words, but Emily could see the hesitation in the way his lips parted, the small flicker of emotion in his eyes before he quickly masked it. The faint tremor in his hands was the only thing that gave him away. He ran a hand through his hair again, the motion so familiar, and for a split second, it almost felt like the man she had loved for years, the man who had once promised her everything, was standing before her. But the moment passed in a rush of bitter clarity. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, the words tumbling out in an exhausted, almost defeated way. "I wasn't planning on it." Emily didn't respond. The night air seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest as she fought to keep herself composed. She could feel the sweat on her brow, the sticky warmth of the evening clinging to her skin, but it wasn't enough to distract from the coldness spreading inside her. This wasn't about his explanation. She didn't want him to explain anymore. She had spent months trying to understand, trying to rationalize the distance between them, but the truth was as sharp as the chill in the air now, cutting through every word he spoke. Her eyes, narrowed slightly, caught the way he refused to look at her directly, how his gaze flickered away every time it seemed like she might see too much. He wasn't meeting her halfway. He wasn't reaching out. And that was the hardest part, the realization that he had been slipping away for so long, and she had been too blind, too willing to hold on to something that had already crumbled. "You've been slipping away for months," she said quietly, each word slow and deliberate, a quiet anger tinged with hurt. "But I waited, James. I waited for you to come back. I kept thinking it was just a phase, that you'd remember who we were." He shifted uncomfortably, looking past her again, his jaw clenched tight. His silence spoke volumes. And in that silence, Emily felt the last of her patience drain away. "I'm sorry," he said again, but the words felt hollow now, How many times had she heard him say that? How many times had she believed it, given him a chance to explain, to make things right? The air between them was thick, charged, but there was no comfort in the closeness anymore. She could feel the weight of his words, but the weight of the lie felt even heavier. "Sorry doesn't fix this," Emily replied, her voice quieter now but steady, holding an edge that she didn't recognize in herself. "It doesn't change what you've done. It doesn't change how much I've been waiting, how much I've been alone in this." The space between them felt like it was growing larger with every word that went unspoken. The sounds of the party still filtered through the air, but they were muffled now, as if the world outside of this small, quiet bubble no longer mattered. "I never meant to hurt you," James said, his voice low. "I swear, I didn't." Emily's eyes flickered briefly to Rachel, who was standing near the edge of the backyard, her figure a dark silhouette against the string of party lights. The woman hadn't been a part of their lives for long, not in any meaningful way. But now, her presence in their home, her proximity to James, the way she had become so familiar with him, it was too much to ignore. "Then why did you?" Emily's voice trembled for the first time, the words catching in her throat. She turned back to James, watching him as he stood there, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes were distant, like he couldn't find a way back to her, even if he tried. Rachel's quiet laugh drifted over to them again, and Emily flinched, the sound of it like a slap. She turned her head quickly, the impulse to confront Rachel almost too strong to fight. But she didn't. Not yet. "Why did you let her in, James? You knew how I felt. You knew how we both felt about loyalty, about our family. And you let her in." The words came out in a rush, a flood of emotion that she couldn't hold back anymore. James took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch her. But Emily took a step back, shaking her head. The gesture was so familiar, but it only filled her with more disgust now. "I didn't want this," he said again, his voice cracking slightly. "It was a mistake, Emily. A stupid, terrible mistake." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, the heat in her chest rising, but she felt nothing like the fiery rage she had expected. There was no burning fury in her, just a hollow ache. "Stop. Stop saying that," she whispered, her voice a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. "A mistake? You don't get to call it that, James. This wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning. This was something else." The words fell from her lips with a clarity that made the world spin a little slower. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She just felt lost. "I never wanted to hurt you," he repeated, his voice barely audible now. She wanted to tell him she didn't believe him. She wanted to scream, to lash out. But the words stuck in her throat, and instead, she simply turned and walked away. Behind her, she could hear James call out her name, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the hollow space left inside her, the world that had shifted in an instant, and the realization that everything she thought she knew was gone. The night air felt colder now, the soft murmur of the party fading with every step she took. The house felt unervingly still, the soft murmur of the party outside only a faint echo in the distance. Emily stood motionless in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, fingers pressing against her palms. The warmth of the evening clung to her skin, but the air inside felt cold, too cold. It wasn't just the absence of noise, but the weight of it, the oppressive quiet that followed James's failed apologies. Every word he had spoken felt like it had bounced off the walls, dissipating into nothingness, leaving only the emptiness behind. She took in a sharp breath, the heaviness in her chest not from the air around her but from the tension in the room. The photographs on the mantelpiece, the wedding picture, Ethan's school portraits, reminded her of what had been, what she had thought was invincible. Now, those memories felt like ghosts, haunting every corner of this place that had once been her sanctuary. James was still there, standing too close to her, his presence a stark contrast to the silence that filled the space. He was waiting for her to say something, anything, to tell him that this was just a moment of frustration, a passing storm. But Emily wasn't going to give him that. Not anymore. His eyes were searching hers, looking for some trace of the woman who had stood by him, trusted him, believed in the promises he had made. But that woman was gone, erased with each lie, each evasive glance, each betrayal. "I didn't mean for this to happen," James said again, his voice barely audible, as if repeating it would somehow make it true. Emily's eyes flicked to him, then away. She hadn't expected anything else. The same words, the same helpless tone. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The phrase had lost all meaning, and she was tired of hearing it. The seconds stretched, the silence growing heavier. She could feel the muscles in her jaw tighten as she fought to hold herself together. Her hands, now cold, slid to her sides, fingers curling into fists. She didn't know how long she could stand in the same room with him, with the man who had once been everything to her, and yet now felt like a stranger. "You're sorry," she said finally, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite anger but more like an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. "But it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change what you've done, what you've taken from me." Her eyes darted to the window, where Rachel stood in the shadows. The woman's presence only served to make the air thicker, more suffocating. James's eyes followed her gaze, then flicked back to Emily, as if the weight of Rachel's presence had finally hit him. The realization that the woman who had once been his wife was standing there, breaking before him, was too much. He moved toward her, his hand outstretched, as if to bridge the gap between them, but Emily took a step back. "Don't," she whispered, almost afraid of her own voice. "Don't touch me." The distance between them seemed to stretch, the space around them suddenly feeling too vast and too small at the same time. James dropped his hand, his body stiffening with the rejection, but he didn't move away. His gaze locked on hers, pleading. "I never meant to hurt you," he repeated, the words so fragile now, falling apart as they left his mouth. He was trying, but the sincerity was buried under too many layers of lies. Emily could see it in his eyes, the panic, the fear that he had lost her, but it was too little, too late. "I'm done, James," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The words felt like the final verdict. There was no anger in them, no yelling. It wasn't that kind of ending. It was simply the truth laid bare. She turned her head toward the door, feeling an almost unbearable pressure in her chest. The life they had built here, the marriage, their home, it had all evaporated, leaving only the cold, empty space that remained. "I'm leaving," she said, more to herself than to him, the words slipping out with surprising clarity. She didn't need to look at him to know how he would react. She could feel his confusion, the hope still lingering in his voice, even as it faltered. "Emily, no." His voice cracked, but she didn't turn back. She couldn't. The house felt as though it was pressing in on her, each corner echoing with memories, with the weight of what was being left behind. She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving toward the door, toward the freedom she hadn't realized she was desperate for until now. The weight in her chest didn't ease, but something else was growing stronger, something that felt like clarity. The more distance she put between herself and the house, between herself and James, the more she could feel the first flickers of herself returning, as though she had been buried beneath the layers of disappointment and grief. She was almost to the door when she heard a voice behind her, cold and sharp. "You can't just leave. You can't just walk away like this." Rachel's voice was unmistakable, and it brought Emily's steps to a halt. She didn't turn, but she could feel Rachel's presence like a shadow at her back. She didn't know why the woman was still standing there, but it was too much. It was all too much. "Get out," Emily said, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She wasn't going to deal with this right now. Not with Rachel, not with anyone. She didn't need Rachel's pity or her feigned concern. Rachel didn't move at first, and Emily could feel her standing there, hovering in the background like a ghost. Her chest tightened at the thought of Rachel, of the way she had slipped into their lives, their home, so effortlessly. But the silence between them didn't last long. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily," Rachel said, her tone distant and strangely calm. It was almost like she had been expecting this. Emily turned sharply, her gaze locking with Rachel's, the woman's eyes calm. But there was a flicker of something else there. Something that Emily didn't want to examine. She could see it now, that sense of entitlement Rachel carried with her. That feeling that she had every right to be a part of this moment, of Emily's life. "You don't get to make decisions for me anymore," Emily said. Her words clipped, her voice dangerously low. She wanted to shout, to scream at her, to throw everything in her path. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, steady, unwavering. James had remained silent, watching the exchange, his face unreadable. He looked back and forth between Emily and Rachel, a lost man, caught between two worlds. The realization was evident now. He had lost both of them, and there was no going back. "I've made my decision," Emily said, her breath steadying. "And I'm done. You've ruined everything. And I'm not going to sit here and let you destroy me." The words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment, it seemed as if everything in the room paused. The silence was unbearable now, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of anger, full of loss, full of a finality that had never been there before. She turned again, reaching for the door, her fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the handle. Behind her, she could feel James's gaze still fixed on her, the weight of his regret pressing into the space between them. But there was nothing left to say, nothing left to feel. The door opened, the cool night air flooding in, carrying with it the promise of escape, of something different. As she stepped through the threshold and into the night, she didn't look back. The house, the party, the memories, everything was behind her now. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. The headlights of Emily's car cut through the dark, the faint glow illuminating the empty road ahead. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. The city was behind her now, its lights fading into the distance as she left everything she had known in the rearview mirror. The steady hum of the engine was the only sound that kept her grounded, but even that felt distant, as though she were drifting through another world. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, the pressure grounding her, but her mind raced with images of the house, of James, of Rachel, ghosts that clung to her like a heavy fog. She didn't want to think about them anymore, didn't want to go over the familiar ache of betrayal and loss, but it was there, gnawing at her thoughts, threatening to pull her under. The phone buzzed again on the passenger seat, but Emily didn't look at it. She already knew who it was, James. His calls had been relentless, each one coming with the same pleading tone, the same apology she had no interest in hearing. She had nothing left to say to him. His words no longer carried weight. She had made her decision. There was no turning back. She pressed the button to decline the call, her thumb moving with a practiced ease, and tossed the phone aside. The sensation of rejecting him felt oddly liberating, even as the car sped further into the night, taking her farther from everything she had once known. The road twisted and turned, each curve a new reminder that she was leaving something behind, though she wasn't sure what was worse, what she had left behind, or the uncertainty of where she was heading. But right now, it didn't matter. She needed space. She needed time to think, to breathe without the constant weight of James's guilt pressing down on her. Her car slowed as she entered a quieter stretch of road. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the silence outside seemed to intensify the weight of her thoughts. There was something oddly comforting about it, this emptiness. It matched the hollow feeling inside her, but there was no peace in it, only the knowing that something had been permanently broken. The glow of a neon sign in the distance caught her eye. A diner, small and faded, nestled on the corner of an otherwise forgotten street. She didn't hesitate. Without a plan, without a destination, Emily turned the wheel and pulled into the lot. The gravel crunched under her tires, the car's headlights flashing briefly across the diner's cracked windows. It was a lonely, weathered place, but it felt like the right kind of refuge. Away from the chaos, away from the questions. As she stepped out of the car, the cool night air greeted her, and she wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of everything she had left behind still lingering like a heavy coat. The diner was warm, the smell of stale coffee and fried food mixing in the air. A couple of patrons sat in the booths at the far end, their conversations low and tired, the flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead casting a sickly glow on the cracked formica tables. The waitress behind the counter gave her a quick once-over but said nothing, her face impassive, as though she'd seen it all before. Emily slid into a booth by the window, the seat sticky under her hands. The buzz of the neon sign outside mixed with the low hum of the old jukebox in the corner, playing a song from another era. She wasn't hungry, but she needed the moment. The quiet, the anonymity, the feeling of being disconnected from everything. She needed to be alone with her thoughts, to process what had happened. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she did look at it, her stomach tightening when she saw the message. "We need to talk. It's about Rachel." The words burned into her mind. For a moment, she just stared at the screen, the message glowing in the dim light of the diner. A cold shiver ran through her. Who was this? Why were they contacting her now, when everything was already falling apart? She quickly tapped out a reply, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Who is this? She set the phone down, trying to ignore the tension rising in her chest, but it was impossible. Her mind raced. She had just left behind everything, and now someone who knew her, who knew Rachel, was reaching out. Emily looked around the diner, her eyes scanning the few patrons still sitting at the counter. One man, his face drawn and tired, stared at the TV above the counter, his fingers wrapped around a half-empty glass. Another woman, probably in her 50s, sat alone, her head bent low, focused on her coffee, oblivious to the world around her. But none of them mattered. The weight of the message sat heavily in her stomach, pulling her deeper into the spiral she had tried so hard to escape. The waitress came by, placing a mug of coffee in front of her without a word. Emily didn't look up, her fingers grazing the cup absently, the warmth offering little comfort. She needed answers, needed to understand what this person knew, and why they were contacting her now. The door to the diner opened with a soft chime, and Emily's gaze flicked to the entrance. A man entered, his figure tall and unremarkable, wearing a dark jacket that blended into the shadows of the night. He paused briefly, scanning the room, his eyes landing on her for just a fraction of a second. She couldn't be sure, but there was something in his glance, something that sent a chill down her spine. The man didn't approach her immediately, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking for her. She glanced at the phone again, her pulse quickening as she tapped her screen. Another message. "Meet me outside. I'll explain everything." Her mind raced. There was no name, no indication of who this person was. Yet they knew about Rachel. They knew enough to be dangerous. Emily's fingers trembled as she typed a quick reply. "Who are you?" She hesitated, then stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her eyes locked onto the man who had entered. He was still standing near the door, his gaze fixed on her, and something in the way he stood made her stomach tighten. She pushed the door open, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. The street was quiet now, the neon lights of the diner casting a pale glow across the sidewalk. The man was standing just beyond the entrance, waiting for her, his hands tucked in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The moment stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight, and Emily felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had no idea who this man was, but she knew one thing for certain. He held a key to everything that had been hidden, and she was about to find out what it was. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what would come next. The man didn't move, just stood there watching her approach. And as she neared, she could see it in his eyes. He knew something. Something about Rachel, about everything that had been broken. And Emily couldn't walk away from this now. Not when everything was falling apart. "Are you the one who sent the message?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The man nodded, the faintest flicker of something in his gaze. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "But I know you, and I know exactly what's been going on." The stranger stood in the glow of the diner's flickering neon sign, his figure partially obscured by the shadows, making him seem more like a silhouette than a man. Emily took in his appearance in quick, measured glances. His worn leather jacket, the scuffed boots, and the casual yet deliberate way he carried himself. Like someone used to being ignored, yet fully aware of the power in holding attention when it mattered. He was tall, his face hard with age and experience, the lines around his eyes deep, as though they had seen more than their share of things people usually didn't talk about. A stubble-covered jaw and dark hair that hadn't been trimmed in days gave him a rugged, almost threatening air. But what caught her most was the faint scar running along his right cheek, the kind that looked old but had been recently reopened, as though the past still haunted him. As he took a step forward, Emily noticed the faint scent of cigarette smoke that clung to him, mixing with the sharp, stale air of the diner. The man was clearly trying to remain composed, but there was something restless about his movements. His hand brushing against his jacket, the subtle tension in his shoulders as though he were constantly on alert, waiting for something to happen. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of the diner's doorframe as she stood, unsure whether to retreat or hear him out. The man spoke first, his voice a low rumble, calm but edged with something Emily couldn't quite place. "You're Emily Mitchell, right?" She nodded, unsure whether she was meant to confirm or question. "I've been watching you for a while," he continued, his gaze flicking to the window behind her, as if to check that no one was listening. He wasn't as interested in her reaction as he was in controlling the space around them, making sure no one could overhear what he was about to say. "Watching me," she repeated, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "For what?" A slow, almost imperceptible smile twisted at the corners of his lips. "For the right moment to talk." His words, casual but weighted, hung in the air between them. He took another step toward her, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement, the sound of it blending with the night's stillness. Emily could feel her pulse quicken. She couldn't tell whether she should be afraid or intrigued, but she knew there was something in his demeanor that demanded her full attention. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his tone more direct now, as though reading her uncertainty. "But you need to know the truth. All of it." "The truth about what?" Emily asked, her heart pounding. She had come to expect the worst today, but the words were like a crack in her understanding. She had no idea who this man was, but his presence was unmistakable, like a ghost that had come to settle her debts. "You've been asking questions. About Rachel, about James," he said, pausing as if considering how much he should say. "I know more than you think." Emily took a steadying breath. Her mind was scrambling to catch up. You're involved with them? With James?" The man tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing as if considering how much of the truth to offer. "Not the way you think?" he replied with a smirk, the first sign of something more unsettling in his demeanor. "But I know who Rachel really is, and I know exactly what James is running from. I can tell you what they don't want you to know." She felt a sharp tug in her chest. The mention of Rachel, of James, sent her spiraling again, as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting. There was something in this man's voice, a certainty that chilled her. This wasn't just about an affair. This was something bigger. But what was his angle? Why was he telling her this now, standing in the middle of the street like some mysterious figure out of a bad movie? "You're not making sense," Emily said, her voice trembling more than she intended. "Why would you come to me now? Why not tell James?" A flicker of something crossed his face, something too quick to place, but it gave her a sense that there was more to his story. He wasn't just a bystander. He had been circling this whole situation for longer than she realized. "Because James is too busy trying to keep his secrets buried?" the man replied, his voice lowering, laced with something like disdain. "And Rachel, well, Rachel's got her own agenda. She's not who you think she is." He paused for a beat, studying her expression, waiting for the weight of his words to settle. Then he added, "You're not the only one who's been lied to." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. His words weren't comforting. They only deepened the confusion she was already drowning in. She had thought she understood everything. She had thought she knew the betrayal, the lies, the distance between her and James. But now, this stranger's cryptic warnings were pulling her into a deeper, darker pit. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze softened for a moment, and she caught a glimpse of something almost human behind the hardness. Something that almost made her trust him. "I want you to understand what's coming. I want you to know the whole story, the parts you haven't seen. James isn't just lying to you about Rachel. There's a lot more at stake here than just his affair." Emily's mind raced. More at stake? What could be worse than the affair? Was there something illegal? Something that could ruin not just their marriage, but their entire lives? He seemed to sense her growing panic and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've been trying to keep it quiet, but you have to hear this before it's too late. James made a deal. A bad one. And Rachel, well, Rachel's tied to it. She's been playing both sides. The thing is, you weren't supposed to find out. Not yet." Emily's eyes narrowed, trying to keep up with his fast-moving words. "A deal?" She struggled to understand what he was saying. "What deal? What does Rachel have to do with this?" The man sighed, a dry sound that seemed to carry more weight than it should. "I'm not the one who should be telling you this, but if you don't listen now, you'll never get another chance to understand. Rachel's not just some flirt who seduced your husband. She's part of something bigger, something James thought he could control. But he's too deep in it now. And the way things are going, everything's about to blow up." His words hit her like a slap. She was dizzy with the implication, with the terrifying idea that James had been involved in something far darker than infidelity. She opened her mouth to ask him more, to demand an explanation, but the man shook his head, cutting her off. "You don't want to know all of it right now," he said, his voice dropping low again. "Trust me, but I'll tell you this. If you want to protect yourself, and if you want to understand how Rachel's involved, you need to meet me. Tomorrow. No one else. Just you." Emily felt a cold rush flood her veins. The offer, the invitation, it was dangerous. But everything in her told her she had no choice. She needed the truth. She needed to understand what James had gotten them into, and why Rachel had been playing both sides. She nodded slowly, her hands trembling in the cold air, as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. "Where?" she asked, almost breathless. The man glanced around once more, his expression hardening again. "I'll text you the address, but be careful. No one can know, not even James." With that, he turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him into the shadows. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She was being pulled into something she wasn't prepared for. She had thought she had a grasp on the situation, but now, everything was shifting. The night felt colder now, the weight of what she had just heard sinking in. She glanced at her phone. There was still no message from James. He hadn't even tried calling again. And in that moment, she realized he wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Tomorrow, the meeting, and the truth. There was no turning back now. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette barely visible under the weak glow of a flickering streetlight. Emily parked at the far end of the lot, the engine's hum cutting through the night's silence. The air felt thick, as though the stillness itself was watching her every move. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the cool metal sending a jolt of discomfort through her. The last few days had been a blur of confusion and betrayal, and now, here she was, standing on the precipice of something she still couldn't fully grasp. The man's words echoed in her mind, their weight sinking deeper with every passing moment. "You're already involved in this. You have a choice, but it's not an easy one." She opened the car door and stepped into the chill of the night, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. The streetlights were sparse in this part of town, the shadows long and impenetrable, creating an atmosphere that was both ominous and eerily quiet. The distant sound of the city was muffled by the high, rusted walls surrounding her. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, trying to steady herself. There was no going back now. The warehouse was an imposing structure, its exterior weathered and worn. The paint had long since peeled, revealing bare metal beneath, and the windows were either cracked or completely boarded up. The door to the building was half open, the faint smell of oil and decay drifting through the gap. Emily approached slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, each one louder than the last. She stopped just inside the entrance and surveyed the interior. The warehouse was as bare as the outside suggested, wide, cavernous, with rows of crates stacked haphazardly along the walls, some of them toppled, as if they had been there for years. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows on the cracked concrete floor. It felt deserted, cold, and oddly suffocating. Emily glanced around, her gaze landing on a figure standing in the middle of the room, motionless. He was waiting for her. The man's posture was relaxed, arms crossed loosely over his chest. But there was something predatory about the way he stood, as though he was ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The low, almost imperceptible hum of a broken fluorescent light above them added to the stillness, creating a tension that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand up. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her with a steady, calculating gaze. His features were harsh, his face worn and weathered by time, and his stubble gave him an air of dishevelment that matched the warehouse's bleakness. His clothes were nondescript, dark jeans, a leather jacket that had seen better days. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled her. It was the way he looked at her, as though he could see right through the walls she had built around herself. "You came," he said finally, his voice low and smooth, like it had been carefully calibrated to sound both authoritative and calm. Emily didn't respond right away. She just stood there, eyeing him, trying to read something in his face that would explain why he was here, why he had reached out to her. His eyes flicked toward her car, then back to her, the briefest flicker of something she couldn't place, shifting behind his gaze. "You don't know me," he continued, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, a shift. "But I know you, and I know everything about this mess you're caught in." Emily felt a flicker of something cold run through her, but she remained still, trying to ignore the knot of unease that had begun to settle deep in her stomach. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice firmer now, trying to regain some control in the face of his disarming calm. The man didn't immediately answer. Instead, he pushed himself off the wall, his boots making a dull thud against the concrete as he moved closer. His steps were deliberate, but there was no rush in them. He was in control of this moment, and he knew it. As he neared, Emily could feel the weight of his presence, a subtle but undeniable pressure that made the room feel even smaller, more oppressive. "Your husband wasn't just hiding an affair," he said, his voice a shade softer now, though still carrying the same heavy undertone. "There's much more at play here, and you need to understand that Rachel wasn't just a mistake or a fling. She's been involved in something much darker than you can imagine." Emily's heart skipped a beat at his words. "Darker than I imagined? What could possibly be darker than an affair?" The weight of his statement felt like a blow, and for the first time, she realized just how little she truly knew about what was going on beneath the surface. "You're lying," she said, though her voice trembled despite her attempt at defiance. "What are you talking about?" The man took another step forward, his presence overwhelming, his face now only a few feet from hers. The faint light from the broken overhead bulbs cast shadows across his features, making his eyes appear darker, more intense. "I'm not lying," he said almost too calmly. "James wasn't just your husband. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And Rachel? She's the one who's been pulling the strings." A chill ran through Emily, and for the first time, she realized she was no longer in control of this conversation. This man, this stranger, knew things she couldn't fathom, things that tied her husband and Rachel to a world she had never seen. "James made a deal," the man continued, his voice low and deliberate, as though savoring the impact of each word. "But it wasn't just about money or power. It was about survival. He thought he could walk away from it all, but that's not how it works. Rachel, she's been working for them, using you, using James, and you've been too blinded by the lies to see it." Emily's pulse quickened, her chest tightening as his words began to sink in. The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't fitting together like she had imagined. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was something far bigger, far darker than she could have ever guessed. She had spent so much time focusing on Rachel, on James's betrayal, but this man was telling her there was more. A conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of her home. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking now, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" He stopped in front of her, his face unreadable, his eyes calculating. "I'm someone who knows how this game works, and I'm trying to help you, before it's too late. James can't protect you anymore, but you can protect yourself. You just have to listen." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You have to understand what's really at stake here, Emily. You're not just fighting for your marriage. You're fighting for your life." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had thought she was fighting to save her relationship, to salvage the life she had built with James. But now, standing in front of this man, she realized that everything she knew had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. The truth was darker, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "What do I do?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't escape now, couldn't run from the truth that was threatening to swallow her whole. The man's eyes softened, just slightly, as if he had been expecting this moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her without a word. "Go to the address inside," he said, "and be ready. The people James is involved with don't play by the rules. They'll do anything to get what they want." Emily took the envelope, her hands trembling as she opened it, revealing a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. The message was clear, and as she read it, her heart sank. The man was right. There was no turning back now. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "If I go there, what happens next?" The man's expression hardened again, his voice steady. "You'll find out what James has been hiding, but be careful. Once you know the truth, there's no unknowing it." With that, he turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Emily stood alone in the warehouse, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands, the weight of her decision sinking in. She had no choice now. She had to find the truth, even if it meant risking everything. The darkness of the night seemed to press in around her, the silence of the empty warehouse now deafening. The world she had known was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, something that would change everything. And as she walked out into the night, the only thing she was certain of was that the real fight was just beginning.